This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Here's a question for you. If you could define good sex in just 3 words, what would they be? Feel free to pause for a moment and think about your answer. In today's show, we're going to talk about the key things that come to mind when people are asked to define good sex. It turns out that there are 20 common responses to this, which we can think of as the main ingredients of the kind of sex that we all really want to be having. So in today's episode, we're going to dive into some of those ingredients and talk about tips for how to incorporate them into your sex life so that you can experience more pleasure, connectedness, and fun in the bedroom. My guest is Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens, an award-winning associate professor at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, where she studies sexual wellness and liberation. With over 70 published articles, Dr. Hargens has made substantial contributions to the field. Her work has been featured widely in the popular media, and she has a debut book titled Good Sex that will be published in February 2025. This is going to be another fascinating and very practical conversation full of lots of tips for better sex. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. When it comes to good sex, confidence is key. When you're not feeling confident, it can become difficult to get and stay aroused. A lot of guys really struggle with this because when there's performance anxiety present, the brain starts getting in the way of the penis. So here's a solution for bringing confidence back into the bedroom. It's called Exerciser, and it's the world's best-selling penis pump with over 1 million satisfied customers. Exerciser harnesses the power of water through a hydraulic vacuum to draw blood safely into the penis and promote healthy circulation. Exerciser is the world's only FDA-regulated hydro pump, and it provides a discreet and effective way to enhance penile health and performance. Some of the benefits include improved erection quality, more staying power, and more intense orgasms. It only takes a few minutes per use and can easily be added to your regular bathing routine. The greatest benefit is typically felt after just 2 weeks of regular use, but similar to the gym, results vary by user and use. Exerciser offers a 60-day, 100% money-back guarantee starting from the day the product lands on your doorstep. If the user is not satisfied for any reason, they'll receive a full refund. To learn more and get a 20% discount off of your purchase, check the show notes for the link or visit exerciser.com/SAP. That's exerciser.com/SAP. Hi, Candace, and welcome to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
Hey, how are you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing well. It is great to meet you and speak with you about your work. So to start our conversation, I often like to ask my guests to tell us a little bit about their own personal journey. So as a sex educator and researcher, I'm curious to hear what your own experience with sex ed was like growing up. So what kind of sex ed did you receive? What kind of messages did you learn about sex? And how did all of that come to shape or influence your career as a sexuality educator?
It was a hodgepodge of things that were not comprehensive sex ed. So I shared that early on, I was really precocious and interested in looking at my grandmother's Encyclopedia Britannica and finding out when I was going to get boobs. That was that was my start. I was like, when am I going to get them? And so finding the information there, and then of course early exposure to finding a secret stash of porn and hip hop from the 90s and the Holy Bible, just a mix of things, Cosmo magazine that had very disparate messages and also incorrect messages in a lot of cases. But I was still trying to find my way because not only did I want to understand sex for myself, but I wanted to teach my peers and to help others learn. And so eventually I put together the parts of it that seemed to make sense and along the way learned how to let go of the parts that did not.
Yeah, it sounds like we had a similar experience in some ways, because I remember my parents had this dusty set of encyclopedias in our basement. And, this was pre the internet era, and there weren't many places you could go to learn about sex. So that encyclopedia became my initial learning source. And there wasn't much in there. It wasn't very useful. There was later a hidden porn stash. My uncle had like stashed a bunch of his old Playboy magazines in a workbench in my grandparents' basement. And my brother and I stumbled onto it one day. And that was the first time I had ever seen porn. And the thing for me that was actually most interesting about it were actually the letters in Playboy. So I read all the articles. And that's kind of like where I got my initial sex ed.
Right. And then you think from now as you are until then, it's like, why didn't we just have these conversations? And that's one of the things that I like asking people about. So you said the messages, and I like asking people now, like, who were your source of messages? Like, who actually did talk to you about sex? And so the person that I got to hear from most, I would say, was my aunt, Tanya. She's no longer with us, but she was the person who felt like I could receive open conversations about sex. Everyone else, I felt a little bit hesitant about asking them, even though it was clear that people around me were having sex.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's a similar experience that a lot of us have where maybe there's like one person that we feel safe or comfortable talking about this with, but we also know for many people, there's just no one that they have a source that they can talk to about this. And that's why the work that sex educators do is so important, because we know everybody's getting different information and a lot of people aren't getting very good information. So you have a forthcoming book that I was able to preview, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's titled Good Sex: Stories, Science, and Strategies for Sexual Liberation. One of my favorite things that you do early on in this book is to talk about how cooking can be a valuable metaphor for sex. So you talk about sex as having different ingredients and seasonings and recipes and menus. So tell us a bit about this idea. Why is it useful to think about sex as being akin to cooking? And, how can we use this to think about sex differently?
Okay, so you know this because you're an author as well. When you're trying to translate your research into something that resonates for people in non-academic settings, it's like, what metaphor lands? Like, what's something that everybody gets? And so this is actually the second metaphor, because the first draft, my editor was like, nobody really understands cotillions. Why was I using a cotillion metaphor? So I was talking about your sexual debut and like how, you make your entrance into society. She's like, this doesn't land for a lot of people. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, my husband is a chef, so he runs a food truck. And I was like, babe, I'm really struggling because that first round just is not going to resonate with everybody. And we were eating, and eating is like my favorite thing to do. And so he was like, it could be that we talk about it like food, like that's what you love. It's something you like talking about as much as you like talking about sex. And I was like, I can run with that. So that's how the sex metaphor in the food space came to be. And then as I thought about it, I was like, oh, this makes sense to me because we have these really unseasoned sexual menus that we get. And then from there, if you really want to have a good meal, you've got to make it to the spice level that you need, the flavor profile that you want, and good sex seasoning just made sense for me for there.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me as well. And, thinking about it, we often talk about things as being on the sexual menu or not. So, we're often kind of already inclined to think about sex as cooking, but I think it adds value to talk about, hey, you've got these different ingredients that you bring in, and you can add these different seasonings or spices to sex, and then you can kind of create these different recipes that you can use. And so it is, I think, a very accessible way of thinking about sex. And when you start thinking about it through those terms, maybe it can become a little bit easier to figure out, what do you need to do if you want to get a little bit more out of sex, or if you want to try and take it to the next level, or if it's not working for you, what can you do to try and adjust it?
Yeah. And one thing that also came to mind for me is that my palate has become more refined throughout my life. And there were seasonings that I was just not exposed to on the food side, for sure, early on in life. So nobody in my community knew about truffle. I love a good truffle situation now, but nobody knew about that. And so as I think about like what seasonings we don't have access to from erotic equity or intimate justice space, that also helped me build out the frameworks for the book.
And I love that idea of a sexual palate. because our sexual tastes do change a lot over the course of our lives. And a lot of things with sex are acquired tastes, right? Where you only learn to like them over time. And that can be for various reasons. We just changed sexually in terms of our openness to trying and exploring new things as we age, but also our bodies change, and what feels good and pleasurable and accessible to us at a given point in time might be different from how it is down the road. So yeah, there's lots of great ways that you can use cooking and taste and flavor and all of these terms as metaphors for what goes on in the bedroom. Now, in your book, you discuss the top 20 ingredients for good sex, which came from some research you conducted, which you called the Big Sex Study, which I think is a great name. I'm going to use that for my next sex study. So, so tell us a bit about the Big Sex Study and those 20 ingredients that you discovered.
Yeah, so I co-led this study with Dr. Shamika Thorpe at the University of Kentucky, and I know she's been a guest on your show before, one of my favorite sex researchers and educators. And we wanted to do a study on Black sexualities, and we wanted it to do it from a sex positive space, thinking about desire and pleasure and some of the stuff that gets omitted or erased from the sexology research that currently exists. And so we were like, okay, how can we do this that complements both of our methodological strengths? I'm big Q qualitative, she's quantitative. And what are some of the ways that we can build in the sex positive components? And the best way for us to just start it was, if you had to describe good sex in 3 words, let us know what those 3 words are. It's an easy question to answer. It's one that gets people thinking. And we got so many great responses. So when we were analyzing those short form data, we were able to, condense some of the words like satisfy and gratify and fulfill into satisfaction. And some of them just stood on their own. As I talk about in the book, consent is not a seasoning, like it's a foundation. And so I couldn't make that one of the chapters in the book by itself with that framework, but I just wanted to weave it throughout. But the top 20 that we got were from over 400 participants, all of whom identified as Black, but different ethnicities, ages, body sizes, genders, sexual identities. And then we asked them a bunch of other questions about good sex, both in a survey and then interviews and then focus groups.
Yeah, and we'll dive into some of the specific ingredients in a little bit, but they included things like good sex is intimate, good sex is connected, it's reciprocal, right? So there are lots of great things in there that we can dive into in a moment in terms of how we can talk about getting more of that in sex or incorporating it in a different way. But something I really appreciate about your book and your research is how you incorporate the perspectives of people who are not often included in or are the focus of a lot of sexuality research that's out there. So tell us a little bit about the standpoint or perspective of your book and how it's different from most other sex books on the market.
Yeah, I would say that with a few exceptions like Sensual Faith, that came out more recently, most of the sex books are not written by Black women. The popular facing sex books are not written by Black women. And the research that gets cited in those books is typically not as intentionally inclusive. And so thinking about who I cited, what their work was about, sometimes in critique and sometimes in like compliment of the work, thinking about how far back I wanted to go and some of the histories of the words. I built all of those things in because I wanted to make it as thoughtfully, intentional, and intersectionally attuned as I could. And at the same time, and I make mention of this, there's no way I can do all of the things. And that's why, I want somebody who has more marginalized identities than I do to come along and write the next best sex book where there's like, oh my goodness, I didn't think about it from this standpoint of immigrant standpoint or a queer and disabled standpoint, like something that would help me to further understand things that because of my privileged identities, I just don't have access to on a deeper level.
Yeah, and we need those different and diverse identities and backgrounds represented in sexuality research and also in how we communicate about this research, because there are limitations when you just have very narrow perspectives that are shared. And sex is one of those things that we know can vary a lot across people of different backgrounds based on their sexuality, their race or ethnicity, their ability status. There are so many different factors that can impact sex in terms of how it is experienced, what is pleasurable, what people need to know about it. So yeah, I would just really appreciate having more work out there that highlights different perspectives. So in your book, you have one chapter devoted to each of the key ingredients to good sex. So I wanted to ask you a few questions about some of those ingredients. Now, one of those ingredients is having fun when you're having sex. And this might sound intuitive to a lot of folks, right? Like sex should be fun, but people often struggle to make sex fun because sex sometimes becomes this high stakes thing where we feel performance anxiety and pressure. And then sex ends up becoming this thing that feels stressful instead of fun. So what can we do to put the fun back in sex?
We have to think about what type of fun you're interested in. And I had a great time writing this chapter because I want to always incorporate fun into the work I do, but I was going through a season of life where I was struggling to enjoy things as much. I mean, I think COVID just did a number, like that era just did a number on me. And so I was like, what do I get to learn about fun that I can also apply to my life? And that's what made it enjoyable for me. But there was thrill fun and chill fun, right? So I talk about thrill fun as being more aligned with excitement, which is also in the book, and like novelty. And it gives you like positive physiological arousal. It heightens your senses, whereas chill fun provides you with like a sort of calm and a sense of well-being, but joy nonetheless. And I'm more of a chill, fun type person most of the time. And so it helped me feel like I'm not missing out on anything if I'm not like always seeking a thrill. It reminded me that me reading a book or writing for fun is an acceptable version of fun. But also when I thought about sex and put the very limited research on fun sex with like the text on fun, the research on fun in the chapter, was thinking about how people can understand what fun is for them, whether it's important to them, and use it to escape what gets promoted, which is really toxic seriousness or putting those high stakes out there. Like you said, making things feel like there's so much pressure behind them that it takes the fun out of it. And that being able to laugh at yourself or your partner with your partner, being able to create fun in a way that's congruent for both of you can be a part of the mix.
Yeah, I love that distinction between thrill fun and chill fun, right? Because there are different types of fun. And so when we're talking about putting the fun into sex, it doesn't mean that it always has to be in like this really edgy and super exciting way, because there are lots of ways to have fun. I also really appreciate what you say about laughter and sex. You know, if I think about some of my own most enjoyable sexual experiences, they're ones where something funny happened, right? And the ability for us to be able to laugh during and after that made the whole experience more fun, right? And so, yeah, it's about sort of being able to lighten the mood and relax. And I know the idea of laughter during sex, I can also understand how that could potentially go wrong if somebody interprets that as, you know, your partner is laughing at you. But you know, the idea is that you're able to laugh together during sex and do it in this lighthearted way that incorporates the type of fun that you kind of need in that moment. I think sometimes we need more of that thrill factor, and other times we need more of that chill factor, right? Because sex and what we need from it or want from it just differs from day to day.
Absolutely.
Now, another key ingredient of sex is connectedness. Now, connected can, of course, mean feeling connected to your partner, but it can also mean feeling connected to yourself. So, can you share some tips with us on feeling more connected during sex?
Absolutely. So I made the distinction between intimacy as connection to your partner or partners and connection as connection with yourself, whether it's a mind body connection, reintegrating pieces that often get compartmentalized because of the way we live our lives and the pace at which we move. And so I built in a section on the strategy of mindful masturbation, which includes like a body scan and slowing down a bit and really being attuned to what you feel, not just in sensation, but what emotions accompany that, what your breath is like as you touch yourself, and for you to have, gratitude and reverence for your body and its ability to engage in sexual experiences and be pleasurable. And so for me, if you're experiencing disconnection, and a lot of this was built on work I've done with my therapy clients as well as research participants. So I was using fictionalized accounts of like a merge of things to protect people's confidentiality. But if you're thinking about it for yourself, you want to consider how fast you move through the day, your sense of yourself and your body, and how you take good care of your body so that you feel present with yourself, grounded in yourself, and that type of connection.
Yeah, and I think this idea, this practice of mindful masturbation can be really useful, right? Because if we want to talk about feeling more connected to our body during sex, it's often easier to start by learning how to experience that connection just by yourself, right? Because when you've got a partner there, that can change the situation a bit and your attention might be divided a little bit more. So, yeah, that practice of mindful masturbation can be really useful. And I think as a starting point for people who don't have any experience with it, it's just about practicing mindfulness in everyday life. And maybe it just starts by sitting in your chair for 5 or 10 minutes each day, closing your eyes, and then just paying attention to your different bodily sensations. And when thoughts come in, you acknowledge them and just let them go. And once you get some experience with that, just sitting there, then try and incorporate that same sort of practice into masturbation, right? Where you're focusing on those bodily sensations and you're just very attuned with the self. And then once you've sort of built up that skill through mindful masturbation, then you can take it and apply it in partnered sex. So it's not like a switch that you can just like instantly turn on and off. I mean, I know when it comes to sex, everybody wants the simple, easy solutions, or they just want a pill that they can take. But these things require a little bit of practice.
And that's one of the things that I highlight in the book really early on, that this is not you're going to do this thing one time and then you're going to have good sex for the rest of your life. And I like to level set people's expectations around that, because if you spend 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years eating from an unseasoned sexual menu, you're not going to just take in mindfulness and have connected sex the next day because you read a chapter I wrote. I wish I was powerful like that, but that's not how it works. So, it takes practice and time. And some of these things are months long, years long endeavors, consistent practice and acknowledgement that you can have compassion as you start and stop on some of these practices, because that's also a component of mindfulness, like having like an unconditional positive regard and a lack of judgment or attachment to, I have to be this way at this time.
Yeah, I think you make a really key point about how when it comes to changing your sex life, a quick fix is going to be just that. It's a quick fix. It's not going to fundamentally change underlying issues or problems in your sex life. So, for example, if you take a pill that helps you with erectile difficulties, that might help in that moment, but it's not going to address underlying sexual communication or other issues that might have contributed to erectile issues in the first place, right? And also like incorporating a sex toy into sex with your partner, maybe it makes it more exciting in that one experience. But again, if there are other underlying issues where you're not communicating about your wants and desires, the toy isn't going to fix that, right? So we need to go beyond this idea of just searching for quick, simple fixes. And it's a process. It takes a bit of work. We need to be willing to put in that work, but it really pays dividends. Now, another ingredient for good sex that you discuss is reciprocity. You say good sex is reciprocal. But reciprocity isn't just about giving your partner something and getting something in return, because when reciprocity feels forced, as in your partner is only giving you what you want out of obligation and they don't actually really want to do it, it doesn't feel that great, right? So tell us a bit about cultivating healthy reciprocity in sexual relationships.
You make a great point that you don't want reciprocity to feel transactional. So it's not tit for tat. I do this for you, you do this for me, because that way of giving feels obligatory as opposed to consensual. And so we want always in all of the ingredients to promote good sex, sex that's good to and for everyone involved. And that in order to have sex, it must be consensual. So that means that you and your partner may have to discuss your yeses, your nos, and your maybe so's. And a lot of sex education folk use that yes, no, maybe so activity to help people think about what's all on your yes list, what's all on your no list. What are some things that are maybe so, meaning it depends on the context, and have a conversation about if you have disparate things on your list, how can you recognize what the underlying need is there? What is the underlying desire about that sexual activity or sexual ingredient you want? Typically, it's a sexual activity or a frequency or like a novelty thing when I'm working with clients that they're like, hey, I want this and my partner doesn't want it. What do we do? And I'm like, okay, what do you want from this? What are you hoping to feel? What are you hoping to learn? What are you hoping to know when you had it before? What was it like? Digging deeper into that. And then for the partner that's like, no, that's on my no list. Like, what were you hoping to feel? What were you hoping to learn? What was it like if you've tried it before? And I think when you get to what underlies the desire, sometimes it might not be that you get that sexual activity or that thing with that person, but that you find another way that you can collaboratively meet the need or address the desire. And so for some people, that might be another activity that feels like it approximates it or it does what you were hoping. And for some people, it might be that they choose to do the thing that their partner wants and try it out. And for other people, it might be that they choose to do that thing with someone else and they consent to an ethically non-monogamous setting, or that's already the makeup of their relationship. So there are a number of ways you can approach reciprocity, and understanding what underlies that thing that you want or the things that you hope to experience is a really good foundation to build on.
Yeah, I love what you just said there. And I think it's also really helpful in the framework of discussing sexual fantasies with a partner. And let's say you share your fantasies and each of you have different kinds of fantasies. So what do you do in that situation? Well, one way is to try and strip those fantasies down into their underlying needs. And what is it that you really want to feel during that experience? Physically, in terms of sensations, what are the emotional needs that you're looking to gratify? And when you have a better understanding of what each partner's underlying needs are, you can then kind of create this custom fantasy that's going to meet everybody's needs. And like you said, it might not look exactly like what you thought it was going to, but that doesn't mean it's going to be any less fun or satisfying, right? It's just a different way of expressing and exploring those sexual needs.
Yeah, because imagine like you had a recipe, right? And you're like, this is the way I like to eat, and that's it. And then you can curate something that's like chef created together, or you can have the same thing that you've always had. It's nice when you get a chance to be with a partner where you can really communicate well and think through how to make it what you want it to be together.
Yeah, chef curated sexual recipes. I
Ooh.
love it. So, one other thing you talk about in the book, I mean, you talk about a lot of things in the book, but one other ingredient you discuss is sexual communication. And, it's so true that communication is important for good sex. And I think that's why communicate more is the single most common piece of sex advice that we hear. But it's also one of the hardest to implement. People really struggle around sexual communication. So, do you have any favorite tips on how we can get better when it comes to communicating about sex?
One of the strategies that I talked about in the book, which I enjoy doing with clients, because I like to add a little spice to sessions where we use psychodrama. And so this version of it is where you act out what your ego sounded like, and then you act out what you were hoping that you were going to communicate. So me and my husband actually have done this before, and it was hilarious. So say, for example, you wanted to try something and you had a little bit of a like snappy, sarcastic tone, then I would invite the client to go all the way up. Like say it in the shittiest way you possibly can. Like and act it out with really big body language, like, give the full throttle of that. And then act out the version of it that you were hoping you communicated in that time as well. And then your partner can act out their response to it in the biggest egocentric type of way they can, and then the version that they really want to give you. And it takes off the table that communication has to be perfectly timed and perfectly said, and your diction is impeccable, because that's not the way human beings operate. And it gives you a chance to like play through some of those emotions in a way that's lighter. outside of the context where it happened, where the emotions actually are high and kind of constricting the way you can operate. And it gives you a safe place to leave it too. So once you communicate it to the most extreme extent, and then you set your sights on what you were hoping to say, you can practice those things that you were hoping to say several times until it becomes a bit more natural for you.
Yeah, I love that advice. And, I've asked a question similar to this many times on the show before, but I've never heard that answer before. So I always love it when we get a fresh take that gives people like a new, different skill they can apply when it comes to sexual communication. And I think there's a lot of value in the approach that you described there, because you're so right that like sexual communication, often there's a way that we intended to say it. Like we know what we wanted to communicate, but it just doesn't come out that way. And so following that sort of exercise kind of allows for the fact that, like, yes, communication is imperfect. There are different ways to say things. Our intention doesn't always come across. But when you have that ability to kind of present it a couple of times, that can allow you to kind of perfect the message that comes across and also inject a little bit of kind of playfulness and fun in it at the same time.
That's right. So my husband and I were saying something the other day. I forgot what it was. And I was like, so basically you just said this, this, and this. And he laughed. He was like, so you heard all that from what I said? And I was like, I heard at least 3 different things that didn't get said. And he was like, oh, okay, well, I did mean that first one. He's like, I didn't say it because it wasn't appropriate. So I was like, because we know each other, we've been together almost a decade at this point, like we can laugh at stuff like that. But I think I talk about this in that chapter as well. A lot of people are really afraid that their relationship can't hold the authenticity of communication. And they're terrified that, even if it's not a committed romantic relationship, that what they're getting from the relationship will end if they're honest. And so there's just ways to practice that.
Yeah. And, that's also another great point that what you said versus what your partner heard can sometimes be 2 totally different things.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for all of this amazing information, Candace. It was truly a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. You can go to my website, drcandicenicole.com, or you can follow me on IG or Facebook and Threads at Dr. Candice Nicole, Candice with an I, CANDICENICOLE. And you can pre-order Good Sex on any bookseller. I have the Good Sex Books bookshop, but you can order it on Amazon or Barnes & Nobles or wherever you find books.
Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sex and psychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.